I need to tell someone about Packer Basin. I've been carrying this for 11 months, and it's getting heavier, not lighter. So I'm going to say it here, and let whatever happens next happen. My name doesn't matter. What matters is that I'm a GS5 park ranger at a mid-sized national forest recreation area in the southern Appalachians. I've been here 3 years. Before that, I was seasonal. 2 summers at a state park in Virginia running the contact station. 1 winter doing maintenance at a campground in Tennessee that got maybe 12 visitors between November and March. I'm 31. I have a forestry degree I've never really used for forestry. I took this job because I wanted to be outside and because my grandfather worked for the Forest Service in this same district 40 years ago. I grew up hearing about these ridges. That's relevant. I'll get to why. If this kind of story is something you find interesting, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel, because there's more to come. When I started full-time, my supervisor gave me a district map with my patrol areas highlighted in yellow. Standard stuff. 7 campgrounds, 2 day-use areas, 40-something miles of maintained trail, a dozen dispersed sites along the forest roads. But there was one area on the map outlined in red with diagonal hash marks through it. No trail symbol, no campground symbol. Just the hash marks and a small text note that read, "Closed, no public access, do not enter without district ranger authorization." Packer Basin. It sits at the head of a drainage between 2 ridges, maybe 4 miles from the nearest maintained trailhead. On the topo map, it looks like a cupped hand. Steep walls on 3 sides, a narrow creek outlet on the 4th where the drainage drops into a gorge. About 600 acres total if you include the slopes. The basin floor itself is maybe 90 acres of relatively flat ground at around 3,800 feet elevation. I asked about it my first week, casual, just trying to understand my territory. My supervisor, I'll call him Dale, barely looked up from his computer. "Resource protection closure," he said. "Been in place since '04. Don't worry about it. It's not in your patrol area." And that was true. It wasn't highlighted in yellow. It wasn't mine to worry about. So I didn't. Not for the first year, anyway. I did my job. I loved my job. I checked campground fee tubes and cleaned fire rings and talked to visitors at the trailhead kiosks and wrote the occasional violation notice for someone camping too close to water. I cleared blowdowns after storms and replaced trail markers when they rotted off their posts. I drove the forest roads and noted erosion and flagged potholes for the maintenance crew. Ordinary, satisfying work. But I kept noticing Packer Basin. Not on the map, on the landscape. From the overlook at Sawyer Knob, which is on one of my patrol trails, you can see straight down into the basin. It's maybe 3 miles away as the crow flies. And it looks like forest. Just forest. Dense hardwood canopy filling the bowl, same as everywhere else in the district. There's nothing visibly wrong with it, except that nothing goes in or out. I realize that sounds strange. Let me explain what I mean. From Sawyer Knob, I've spent probably 50 or 60 afternoons eating my lunch and watching the landscape below. I see birds moving. I see weather systems crossing the ridges. I watch the color of the canopy change through the seasons. And I watch animals. This is good deer country, good turkey country. I regularly glass black bears on the opposing slopes. Red-tailed hawks work the thermals above the ridgelines. But Packer Basin is quiet. Not silent, I don't mean it like that. The trees move in the wind, rain falls into it. But I've never seen a hawk circle over it. I've never seen a deer on the edges where the slopes meet the basin floor. I've never seen a bear cross through the outlet drainage, which would be the natural travel corridor. I told myself I was imagining it. that I wasn't watching carefully enough, that animals were in there, and I was just looking at the wrong times. For almost a year, that explanation worked fine. Then I started hearing about it from other people. The first was an older guy named Coyle, who ran the volunteer trail crew on the East Side trails. He'd been volunteering in this district for maybe 15 years. We were splitting a thermos of coffee at the Birch Hollow trailhead after a workday when he gestured vaguely toward the northwest. "You ever been up into Packer?" I told him no. Closed area, off limits. He nodded slowly, like I'd confirmed something. Used to be a trail up there. Old CCC trail from the 30s. Good stonework on the switchbacks. They pulled it off the maps when they closed it. But the tread's still there if you know where to look. He sipped his coffee. My father-in-law hiked it in the 70s. Said it was the prettiest basin in the district. Said there was an old homestead foundation and a spring that ran cold enough to hurt your teeth in August. I asked him why it was closed. He looked at me for a long moment. Not suspicious. More like he was deciding something. They said threatened species habitat. Some plant, some salamander. One of those. Changes depending on who you ask and when you ask them. I said that made sense. Resource protection closures happen all the time. Sure, Coyle said. But they don't usually happen overnight. And they don't usually come with a law enforcement ranger posted at the trailhead for 6 weeks after. He finished his coffee and screwed the cap back on the thermos. Probably nothing. Just always thought it was odd. I let it go, but I didn't forget it. The second person who mentioned Packer Basin was a dispatcher named Rita, who worked out of the district office. We were both there late one evening, me finishing incident reports, her monitoring radio traffic that had gone quiet for the night. We got to talking about the district's history, old campgrounds that had been decommissioned, trails that had been abandoned. I mentioned Packer Basin offhandedly. Just the name. Rita's expression changed. Not dramatically. She didn't go pale or gasp or anything like that. But something in her face tightened. She turned back to her console and said, very evenly, "That's above my pay grade and yours." I waited. She didn't say anything else for maybe 10 seconds. Then, "The closure order gets renewed every 5 years. It's the only one in the district that does. Most resource protection closures either become permanent wilderness designations or they get reviewed and reopened. That one just keeps getting renewed. Same language every time." I processed the paperwork. She looked at me. "The authorization signature comes from the regional office. Not from Dale, not from our district ranger, regional." I asked if that was unusual. "In 22 years, she said, I've never seen another closure order signed at regional level for this district, not once." After that conversation, I started looking for the closure order in our filing system. Not to do anything with it, just to understand. The current order was there, signed in 2019, good through 2024, standard language, threatened and endangered species habitat protection, no public entry, no camping, no hunting, no research permits. The signatory was a deputy regional forester whose name I didn't recognize. But when I searched for the original 2004 order, it wasn't in the digital system. Pre-digitization, presumably. The physical files from that era were in storage boxes in the basement of the district office. I went down there one afternoon during a rainstorm when there was nothing else pressing. It took me 40 minutes to find the right box. The original 2004 closure order was a single page. Same format as the current one. But the listed reason was different. It said, public safety. Not resource protection, not threatened species. public safety. And stapled to the back of it was a handwritten note on Forest Service memo paper, undated, in handwriting I didn't recognize. It said, "Reclassify per regional direction. Use T&E language for public-facing documents. Original incident reports filed separately. Do not duplicate." I stood in that basement with the paper in my hands, and I felt something shift in my chest. Not fear exactly. More like the feeling you get when you realize a locked door isn't protecting what's inside from you. It's protecting you from what's inside. I put the paper back. I went upstairs. I finished my shift. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. Public safety. What kind of public safety concern requires a 20-year closure, renewed every 5 years, authorized at the regional level, reclassified to hide the original reason? I started paying more attention at Sawyer Knob, bringing binoculars, watching the basin for longer periods. And the more I watched, the more certain I became. Nothing moved in there. Not at the canopy level, where you'd see birds. Not at the forest floor level, where you'd see deer. Not in the air above it. The basin sat in the landscape like a gap in a sentence. Everything around it functioned normally. The basin itself just didn't participate. I want to be clear about something. I'm not a paranoid person. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I don't believe in the supernatural. I'm a park ranger with a forestry degree, and I believe in observable, measurable phenomena. And what I was observing was an absence. A consistent, repeatable absence of normal biological activity in a 600-acre drainage basin that should have been teeming with life. In August of my second year, I did something I probably shouldn't have. I drove out to the forest road that passes closest to Packer Basin. Forest Road 227, a single-lane gravel track that skirts the eastern ridge above the drainage. The road itself isn't closed. It's just not maintained well enough for most passenger vehicles, so it gets very little traffic. I parked at a wide spot and walked to the ridge edge where, through the trees, I could look down into the basin from maybe half a mile away. The canopy looked normal. Oaks, hickories, some tulip poplar in the lower areas. Full summer leaf. A slight breeze was moving the upper branches. I stood there for maybe 20 minutes, just watching and listening, and I heard absolutely nothing. No birds, no insects, no squirrel chatter, no woodpecker drumming. August in the southern Appalachians. You should be drowning in sound. Cicadas alone should be deafening. But standing on that ridge edge, looking down into Packer Basin, there was only the sound of wind in leaves. Like someone had taken a living forest and removed everything that wasn't a tree. My radio crackled. Routine traffic from dispatch. The sound startled me so badly, I dropped it. And when I picked it up off the ground and looked back toward the basin, something was different. I couldn't tell you what exactly. The canopy looked the same. The light looked the same. But I had this sudden, overwhelming impression that something down there was now aware that I was on the ridge. I'm not someone who trusts feelings like that. I'm trained to observe, to document, to be rational. But I walked back to my truck faster than I needed to. And I didn't go back to that spot on FR 227 for 3 months. What I did instead was try to find the original incident reports filed separately that the memo had referenced. I searched every filing cabinet and storage box in the district office basement. I searched the digital records management system with every keyword combination I could think of. I found nothing. Whatever had happened in 2004 that precipitated the closure, the actual event, the actual reason, had been removed from the district level entirely. So I tried a different approach. I started talking to people who had been in the district in 2004. This was harder than you might think. 20 years is a long time in federal employment. People transfer, people retire, people leave the agency entirely. The current district ranger had only been here since 2018. Dale had arrived in 2011. Most of the field staff had turned over at least once in that period. But the local community doesn't turn over like that. People in these mountain towns stay for generations. And they remember. I found a retired man named Harold Easton, who had been the county's volunteer search and rescue coordinator from 1998 to 2007. He lived about 40 minutes from the district office, in a small frame house on a hillside, with a vegetable garden and 3 German shepherds. When I showed up at his door in my uniform and said I was from the Forest Service, he looked at me for a long time before inviting me inside. We sat at his kitchen table. I told him I was trying to understand the history of the Packer Basin closure. I said I'd found the original order and the reclassification note. I said I was just trying to understand what had happened. Harold poured us both coffee. He didn't speak for almost a full minute. Then he said, "How old are you?" 30, I told him, at the time. "So you were about 10 when it happened." He looked out his kitchen window at the dogs in the yard. "We got a call out in September of '04. Missing hiker, male, mid-30s, experienced. He'd told his wife he was going to hike the old CCC trail up into Packer Basin. There was no closure then. It was just backcountry. Remote, but legal." Harold paused, drank his coffee. "We searched for 3 days. I ran the search personally. 16 volunteers, 2 dog teams, a helicopter on the second day. We found his vehicle at the old trailhead pullout. We found his boot prints on the first quarter mile of trail. And then we found nothing. I mean nothing. Dogs lost the scent. Trail was clear, good tread, dry conditions, no blowdowns. His tracks just stopped, like he'd been lifted off the ground." I asked if they'd gone into the basin. Harold set his coffee down. We went into the basin, all 16 of us, spread out on a grid search. The dogs wouldn't go. Both teams, different handlers, different dogs, refused. Wouldn't go past a certain point on the trail. Not the same point for each dog, but within about 100 yards of each other. We continued on foot without them. He was quiet again. I didn't push. "The basin is beautiful," he said finally. "That part's true. Big trees, cold spring, old foundation stones from a homestead that must have been there before the Forest Service acquired the land. And it's quiet. I thought at the time it was just peaceful. That's the word I used in my report, peaceful." He looked at me directly. "We searched for 6 hours, found nothing. No gear, no clothing, no disturbance. Nothing to indicate a human being had been there in decades. But when we came back out, when we got back to the vehicles..." Harold stopped. He picked up his coffee cup, looked at it, set it back down. 6 hours, he said. "We went in at 8 in the morning. We came out at what I thought was 2 in the afternoon. 6 hours. But when we got back to the vehicles, it was dark. Full dark. After 9 p.m. I didn't say anything. 13 hours, Harold said. We were in there for 13 hours. But every single person on that team, all 16 of us, experienced 6 hours. We ate lunch at what we thought was noon. We took breaks at normal intervals. 6 hours of work, 6 hours of memory. But 13 hours passed. He pushed his coffee cup away from him. I put it in my report, every word. And 48 hours later, 2 people from the regional office drove down here and sat in my living room, this room, and asked me to amend my report. They said the time discrepancy was a GPS artifact. They said our watches had malfunctioned due to magnetic anomaly in the basin's geology. They gave me a very reasonable explanation. "Did you believe it?" I asked. Harold looked at me with an expression I can only describe as exhausted. "Son, the sun was in the wrong place. When we came out of that drainage and the darkness hit us, we looked up and the sun was gone. It wasn't a watch malfunction. It wasn't a GPS error. We lost 7 hours inside that basin that none of us lived through. 7 hours that didn't happen to us, but happened to the world." He stood up and refilled his coffee. When he sat back down, his voice was flatter, more controlled. "They found the hiker 2 days after our search. He was at a rest area on the interstate, about 60 miles south, walking along the shoulder. A state trooper picked him up. He was confused. He thought it was the same day he'd started his hike. He was wearing the same clothes. He wasn't dehydrated. He wasn't hungry. He was fine, physically. But he'd been missing for 5 days. "What did he say happened?" I asked. "He said he hiked into the basin. He said he ate lunch by the spring. He said he started hiking back out. And then he was on the interstate. That's it. That's all he remembered. No gap, no blackout. He ate lunch, and then he was 60 miles away, and 5 days had passed." Harold looked at me. "The closure went up the following week. The regional people handled everything. They talked to the hiker. They talked to every member of my search team individually. They gave everyone the same GPS artifact story. And then Packer Basin was closed to the public, and it's been closed ever since." I sat at Harold's kitchen table for a long time after he stopped talking. The dogs were barking at something outside. Normal afternoon sounds. I felt like I was sitting in 2 worlds. The normal one where dogs bark and coffee gets cold and time passes at the rate it's supposed to. And another one where a 600-acre basin in the mountains has been sealed off for 20 years because time doesn't work right inside it. I thanked Harold. I drove back to the district office. I sat in my truck in the parking lot for 20 minutes before going inside. Here's what I should have done. Nothing. I should have filed the information away as local legend, as an old man's imperfect memory of a confusing search, as a curiosity with a rational explanation I simply hadn't found yet. I should have done my job and left Packer Basin alone. Here's what I did instead. I drove to the town library. The library in the nearest town is small, a single room in the back of the community center. But it has bound copies of the local weekly newspaper going back to the 1940s. I pulled the volumes for 2004 and started reading September issues. The missing hiker made the paper. Small item, page 3. Local man missing after day hike. The following week, missing hiker found safe. That was it. No details about where he was found or the circumstances. No mention of a 5-day absence. No mention of the search team's experience. Just found safe. But while I was looking through those issues, I noticed something else. A letter to the editor published 3 weeks after the hiker was found. It was from a woman named Patricia Devlin. And it said, "I am writing to ask why the Forest Service has closed Packer Basin without proper public notice or comment period. My family has hunted that drainage for 4 generations. My father packed elk out of there in the 1960s. In 1987, my brother Marcus walked into Packer Basin to scout for deer season and did not come home for 3 days. He was found in Carverton, 11 miles away by road, with no memory of the intervening time. The Forest Service investigated then and did nothing. Now another person has had the same experience, and suddenly the area is closed. Why was it not closed in 1987? Why was my brother's experience not enough? I read that letter 3 times. The same thing had happened in 1987, and apparently nothing had been done about it then. I photographed the letter with my phone. And then, because I was already down the rabbit hole, I pulled the 1987 newspapers. It took me an hour to find it. October 1987. A brief item on page 5. Hunter located after 3-day search. Marcus Devlin, age 34, reported missing after failing to return from a solo hunting trip in the Packer Basin area. Located by his family in Carverton, approximately 11 miles from his vehicle. Uninjured, disoriented, no details on circumstances, 11 miles. The hiker in 2004 had been found 60 miles away. Marcus Devlin in 1987 had been found 11 miles away, both with no memory of the intervening time. Both physically unharmed. Both convinced virtually no time had passed. I was still processing this when I found one more item. July 1971. Not a news article, a classified ad. It read, "Missing. Walter Pembroke, 67. Last seen July 4th entering Packer Basin area via old CCC trail. Family requests any information. Contact Pembroke residence, Route 2. There was no follow-up, no found safe item in subsequent weeks. I checked every issue through the end of 1971. Nothing. Walter Pembroke went into Packer Basin in 1971 and, as far as the local paper was concerned, never came out. I left the library as it was getting dark. The drive back to my apartment took 35 minutes, and I don't remember any of it. My mind was working on something it couldn't quite assemble. 3 incidents across 33 years. 2 people reappearing miles away with no memory. 1 person never found at all. And a 600-acre basin where time doesn't behave the way it should, and nothing living seems willing to stay. I want to tell you that I was afraid. But the truth is more complicated than that. What I felt was recognition, because my grandfather had worked in this district in the 1970s. And when I was a kid, he used to tell me stories about these mountains. Most of them were normal. Bear encounters, rough winters, difficult trails, but once, just once, when I was maybe 8 or 9, he told me about a place he refused to go. He said there was a basin, he didn't name it, where the day was longer than it should be, where you could walk in at sunrise and walk out at what felt like mid-morning, and the sun would already be going down. He said it like a joke, like an old woodsman's tall tale. And I'd forgotten about it completely until I was sitting in my truck outside my apartment with a phone full of photographs of 30-year-old newspaper clippings. My grandfather, 1970s, this district, Walter Pembroke, went missing in July 1971. Had my grandfather been part of the search? Had he gone into the basin himself? Is that how he knew? I couldn't ask him. He died in 2016. But the recognition I felt sitting in that truck wasn't professional curiosity anymore. It was personal. This place had been part of my family's history before it was part of my career. And that's when I made the decision that I'm still not sure was right. I decided to go into Packer Basin. Not recklessly, not without preparation. I want to be clear about that, because what I did was a violation of a lawful closure order, and I could lose my job over it, and I know that. But I didn't just walk in blind. I spent 3 weeks preparing. First, I tried every legitimate avenue I could think of. I submitted a written request to Dale for authorization to enter the closed area for resource monitoring purposes. He denied it the same day, verbally, without putting anything in writing. He said the closure was managed at regional level and he didn't have authority to grant access. He suggested I focus on my actual patrol areas. I asked him directly, "What's in there that requires a 20-year closure?" He looked at me for a long time, longer than a normal conversational pause. Then he said, "Sensitive habitat. That's what the order says. That's what it is." "The original order said public safety," I told him. Dale's face didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. He said, "Where did you see that?" I told him, "The basement, the physical files." He nodded slowly. "Those files should have been transferred to regional archives years ago. I'll have someone take care of that." He paused. "Listen, you're a good ranger. You've got a future here. Some closures exist for good reasons that aren't our business at the district level. That's just how the agency works. Focus on what's in front of you." That was the last time Dale and I spoke about Packer Basin. 2 days later, I noticed the storage box from the basement was gone. The entire box, not just the closure order, but everything in it. I checked. The shelf where it had been was empty and recently dusted. I don't want to characterize Dale as a villain in this. He's not. He's a mid-career supervisor doing what his superiors expect of him. He wasn't threatening me. He was trying to protect me in his own way. I believe that. But the box disappearing told me something important. Whatever was in Packer Basin, the agency's interest wasn't in understanding it. It was in maintaining the perimeter. And that distinction mattered to me. I prepared methodically. I bought a personal GPS unit, not agency equipment, and programmed waypoints for the basin using coordinates I pulled from the topo maps. I bought a watch with a second hand that I synchronized with the atomic clock signal. I bought a second watch, a cheap digital one, and synchronized it to the same source. I'd wear both. If Harold's story was accurate, if there truly was a time discrepancy, I wanted to measure it. I told my neighbor I was going hiking for the day, gave her a departure time and a return time, and said if I wasn't back by dark to call the county sheriff, not the Forest Service. I didn't explain why. She thought I was being paranoid. Maybe I was. I chose a Wednesday in early October. The forest roads would be empty. Hunting season hadn't opened yet and the leaf peeper traffic hadn't started. I drove FR 227 to the wide spot where I'd parked before, then continued on foot along the ridge until I found what I was looking for. The old CCC trail. Coyle had been right. The tread was still there. Not maintained in any way. No blazes, no brushing, nothing to indicate official trail status. But the CCC crews in the 1930s, built to last. The stone steps were still solid. The grades were still walkable. 90 years of leaf litter had softened the edges, but hadn't erased the path. I started down. The descent into Packer Basin took about 40 minutes. The trail switched back down the eastern slope through mature hardwood forest. Big oaks, the kind that are 200 years old or more. It was a beautiful morning, cool, clear. The October colors were just beginning to turn. I heard blue jays on the upper slope, a woodpecker somewhere to my left. Normal forest sounds. Until they stopped. I can't tell you the exact moment. It wasn't like flipping a switch. But at some point during the descent, maybe 2/3 of the way down, I realized I was walking in silence. No birds, no insects, no small rustling in the underbrush, just my boots on stone and the faint sound of my own breathing. I checked my watches. Both read 8:47 a.m. I'd started down at 8:05. 42 minutes of hiking. That tracked with the distance and terrain. No discrepancy. I made a mental note and kept going. The trail leveled out as it reached the basin floor. The forest here was different. Not wrong, exactly. Just different. The trees were older. Much older. I'm not an arborist, but I've spent enough time in Appalachian hardwoods to estimate age by diameter. And some of these oaks were pushing 4 feet across at breast height. That's 300, maybe 400 years of growth. Older than the Forest Service. Older than the country. The canopy was so dense that the forest floor was deeply shaded, even in October, with the leaves beginning to thin. And it was quiet. Not the aggressive silence of a soundproofed room, nothing like that. The wind still moved through the upper canopy. Leaves still rustled. But there was nothing alive, making sound except me. No bird song, no squirrel alarm calls. Nothing. I found the spring Harold had mentioned. It came up out of a cluster of moss-covered rocks and ran a few yards before disappearing into the ground again. The water was clear and cold. I touched it but didn't drink. Nearby were the foundation stones of the old homestead. 4 low walls of stacked fieldstone, maybe 20 by 30 feet, collapsed enough to be nearly flush with the ground. A root cellar depression behind them, partially filled with leaves. I stood by the spring and checked my watches again. 9:23 a.m., both watches, consistent with each other. I'd been in the basin for about 36 minutes. Nothing unusual, no time discrepancy, no disorientation, just a quiet old forest with no apparent wildlife. I was almost disappointed. I'd half expected something dramatic, some obvious immediate wrongness that would validate everything I'd heard. Instead, I was standing in a peaceful, if unusually quiet forest clearing, feeling slightly foolish about my 2 watches and my neighbor's emergency instructions and my careful preparations for what was turning out to be an unremarkable walk in the woods. I decided to do a circuit of the basin floor, cover as much ground as I could in a couple of hours, then hike back out and admit to myself that Packer Basin was just an ecologically unusual area where some old coincidences had grown into local legend. I started south from the spring, picking my way through the understory. That's when I found the second foundation. It was about 300 yards south of the first one, partially hidden by a stand of rhododendron. Same style, stacked fieldstone walls, low to the ground, clearly very old, but larger, maybe 40 by 60 feet, and with a stone chimney still standing at one end, about 8 feet tall. This wasn't on any map I'd seen. The first foundation, the one Harold knew about, was noted in some older district records as a historic homestead site. But no one had mentioned a second structure. I walked the perimeter, taking photos on my personal phone. The construction was identical in style. Same era, presumably. Maybe a barn or a secondary dwelling. I was crouched by the south wall examining the stonework when I noticed something that made me stop. There was a mark on one of the foundation stones. Not a natural feature, a carved mark. A circle, roughly 2 inches in diameter, with a vertical line through it, cut into the stone with a chisel or similar tool. Old, weathered, but clearly deliberate. I stood up and looked more carefully at the other visible stones. I found 3 more marks along the south wall. 2 were the same circle and line. The third was different. A horizontal zigzag, like a crude representation of water or a wave. I'm a ranger, not an archaeologist. I don't know what these marks mean. They could be property markers, mason's marks, anything from the homesteading era. But something about them felt deliberate, in a way that went beyond mere construction notation. They faced inward, toward the interior of the foundation, as if they were meant to be seen from inside, not outside. I photographed all of them, checked my watches. 10:04 a.m., both consistent, still no time anomaly. I was beginning to think Harold's story was either exaggerated or a one-time occurrence that had resolved itself. I continued south. The basin floor sloped gradually upward toward the far ridge. The trees remained old and dense. The silence remained absolute. I walked for what felt like about 20 minutes, and then I stopped, because something was wrong with my spatial understanding of where I was. I should have been approaching the southern slope of the basin. Based on the topo map, the flat floor is roughly a quarter-mile across at its widest point. I'd walked at least that distance from the spring. I should have been gaining elevation, feeling the ground tilt upward beneath my feet. But the ground was still flat. Still the same dense, level, old-growth forest floor. I pulled out my GPS. The GPS showed me exactly where I expected to be, near the southern edge of the basin at approximately 3,800 feet elevation. According to the device, the slope was right in front of me. 50 yards south, the terrain should begin rising steeply toward the ridgeline. But it wasn't. I could see at least 200 yards ahead of me through the trees, and the ground was level, flat, unchanged. The same ancient oaks and hickories stretching ahead in every direction. I stood there for a long time. I'm trained to trust my instruments. GPS is GPS. It talks to satellites. It doesn't lie. But what my eyes were showing me and what my device was showing me did not agree. I turned around, walked back north. After about 5 minutes, I found the second foundation again. The rhododendron, the standing chimney. Good. I hadn't gotten disoriented. I continued north toward the spring. The spring was where I'd left it. The first foundation was where it should be. I was back in territory I'd already covered, and my confidence settled somewhat. I checked the GPS again. It now showed me at the approximate center of the basin, which matched. Both watches read 10:31 a.m., consistent with each other, consistent with my experience of time. Whatever was strange about the southern portion of the basin, it wasn't a time effect. It was spatial. The terrain didn't match the maps, or the maps didn't match the terrain. I want to pause here and acknowledge something. I am aware of how this sounds. I'm a park ranger reporting that a valley is bigger on the inside than the maps say. That's not a credible professional observation. If I put that in an incident report, I would be referred for a fitness for duty evaluation. I know that. But I know what I saw. I know how far I walked. And I know that the ground did not rise where every map and every instrument said it should. I decided to leave. I'd been in the basin for about 2.5 hours at that point, and I had what I came for. Confirmation that the place was anomalous, even if the anomaly wasn't exactly what I'd expected. I started back toward the CCC trail on the eastern slope. And that's when the time problem now started. The hike from the spring to the base of the CCC trail was about 10 minutes on the way in. I remembered clearly. I'd noted landmarks. A fallen tulip poplar across a seasonal drainage. A cluster of large boulders where the slope began to steepen. The first stone steps of the CCC switchbacks. I walked north from the spring, following my own tracks in the leaf litter. 10 minutes passed. 15, 20. I didn't find the fallen tulip poplar. I didn't find the boulders. The ground remained flat. The forest remained the same dense old growth. And the eastern slope, which I should have been approaching, remained invisible. I checked the GPS. It showed me directly on track, approaching the base of the CCC trail. According to the device, I was within 100 yards of the first switchback. I was not. I was in flat forest with no slope in sight. I stopped walking. I stood still, and I controlled my breathing, and I made myself think clearly. GPS malfunction. That was possible. Satellite geometry in a deep basin could cause errors. I was getting a fix, but the fix could be wrong. Okay. So, navigate by terrain. The basin has 3 steep walls and 1 outlet drainage to the north. If I walked in any direction long enough, I should hit a slope. Any slope. And once I was on a slope, I could work my way up to the ridge and back to my truck. I picked a direction, east, based on my compass, and walked. The compass I trust. The compass doesn't talk to satellites. It reads the Earth's magnetic field. I walked due east for what I estimated, carefully counting paces, to be 600 yards. The ground did not rise. I turned north, walked 600 paces. The ground did not rise. I want to tell you I didn't panic. That would be a lie. For about 5 minutes, I stood in that flat, silent forest, and I fought down a terror that I can only describe as architectural. It wasn't fear of an animal or a person. It wasn't fear of injury or death. It was the fear of being inside something that was shaped wrong, of being in a space that didn't obey the rules that every other space I'd ever occupied obeyed. I closed my eyes, breathed, opened them. The forest looked exactly the same in every direction. Ancient trees, dense canopy, flat ground. No landmarks I could differentiate. And silence. Absolute biological silence. Just the wind in the canopy and my own heartbeat. I checked my watches. The analog read 11:15 a.m. The digital read 11:15 a.m. Good. Consistent. I'd been in the basin for about 3 hours. I had plenty of daylight. I was not lost. I knew exactly where I was. I was in Packer Basin. The problem was that Packer Basin appeared to be significantly larger than its physical boundaries on any map indicated. Or rather, the problem was that I couldn't find the edges. I made a decision. I would sit down, right where I was, and wait. Not walk. Not try to find the slope. Just wait. Because the 2 people who had gone into this basin and come out alive, the hiker in 2004, Marcus Devlin in 1987, they had both come out. Not where they expected to, not when they expected to, but they came out. And the one thing both of them had in common was that they didn't remember a prolonged experience of being trapped. They experienced a brief time, a lunch by the spring, a start of the hike back, and then they were elsewhere. Maybe fighting it was the wrong approach. Maybe walking was what kept you in. So I sat down at the base of a white oak that must have been 400 years old. I drank some water from my pack. I ate a granola bar. And I waited. I'm going to describe the next part as accurately as I can, but I want to acknowledge that my memory of it is not entirely sequential. There are places where the order of events feels uncertain. I've gone over it many times in my mind, and I'm giving you what I believe to be the correct sequence. But I was afraid, and fear distorts memory. I know that. I sat for what felt like about 30 minutes. The forest was unchanged. Wind in the canopy, no other sound. The light filtering through the trees maintained the same late morning quality. No shadows shifting, no sense of the sun tracking across the sky. Just a consistent, even illumination that could have been 10 a.m. or could have been 2 p.m. And then I heard something. It came from the south, from the direction I'd walked earlier, the direction where the terrain should have risen but didn't. A sound like footsteps on dry leaves. Slow, deliberate, approaching. I stood up. Every instinct I have, professional, personal, animal, went to high alert. I stared south through the trees. The visibility was maybe 150 yards under the dense canopy. I could see nothing moving. But the footsteps continued. Closer, steady, the rhythm of a person walking at a normal pace, leaves crunching under boots. And I realized, with a sensation like ice water down my spine, that the rhythm was wrong. Not wrong like an animal that doesn't walk like a human, wrong like a recording of footsteps played at slightly the wrong speed. Just a fraction too regular, too metronomic. No variation for terrain. No pause, no adjustment. I took 3 steps backward. The footsteps stopped. Silence. I waited. 1 minute, 2. Nothing. I took a step forward. The footsteps resumed. Same pace, same direction. Coming toward me. I stopped. They stopped. I want to be clear. I could see nothing. There was nothing visible to me making those sounds. The forest floor was open enough that I should have been able to see anything person-sized within 100 yards. Nothing was there. I thought about Harold's search team. 16 people. They'd spent 13 hours in the basin and experienced 6. They'd all come out. All of them. Whatever was in here hadn't harmed them. Maybe it wouldn't harm me. But Walter Pembroke had come in here in 1971. And Walter Pembroke had never come out at all. I turned north and walked, briskly. Not running. I didn't trust myself to run without falling on the uneven forest floor, but fast. Behind me, the footsteps resumed, matching my pace exactly. Same distance, never gaining, never falling behind. I walked for what felt like 10 minutes. The ground didn't change, the trees didn't change, the light didn't change, and the footsteps maintained their perfect, metronomic spacing behind me. Then I saw the spring, the same mossy rocks, the same clear water emerging from the ground and disappearing a few yards later. I was back where I'd started, or close to it. And when I reached the spring, the footsteps behind me stopped. I turned around. Nothing. Empty forest. The same silence I'd been walking through all morning. I checked my watches. The analog read 11:47 a.m. The digital read 3:22 p.m. I stared at them. The analog watch, with its mechanical movement, ticking away on my left wrist. 11:47. The digital watch, quartz crystal, battery-powered, on my right wrist. 3:22. A 3.5-hour discrepancy that had developed in the time since I last checked, when both had read 11:15. One of them was wrong, or both were wrong, or time had passed differently for each of them, which doesn't make sense because they were both on my body, both in the same location. Both? I didn't stand there reasoning about it. I looked at the light filtering through the canopy and tried to judge the sun angle. And I couldn't. The light was the same diffuse, directionless illumination it had been all day. No shadows, no angle. As if the light in the basin didn't come from a point source at all, I made a decision. I was going to walk east until I hit something. A slope, a road, a fence, anything that constituted an edge. And I was going to do it without stopping, without turning around, and without engaging with whatever was making those footsteps behind me. I oriented with my compass, due east, and I walked. I counted paces. At pace 600, roughly a third of a mile, the ground began to rise. I almost cried. The terrain was finally doing what terrain is supposed to do. The slope steepened under my feet. I was climbing out of the basin. I could feel the grade in my calves. The trees began to thin slightly as I gained elevation. I kept going, faster now, climbing hard. At what I estimated was 800 feet of elevation gain, which should have put me well above the ridge crest, the ground leveled out, and I was standing at the spring again. Same spring, same rocks, same cold water. The first foundation, 50 yards to my west. The second foundation visible to the south through the rhododendron. I had climbed 800 vertical feet due east and ended up exactly where I'd started on the basin floor. I sat down on the ground next to the spring. I put my head in my hands. And I understood, with perfect clarity, why the Forest Service had closed this area, and why they would never reopen it, and why the closure was signed at the regional level, and why the original incident reports had been removed from the district. Packer Basin doesn't have edges. You can see them from outside. The ridges are there, the slopes are there, the drainage drops into a gorge. But from inside, there is no out. The geometry of the place is wrong, not in an abstract, theoretical way, in the concrete, physical way that your boots report to your legs, report to your brain. You can climb for an hour and end up where you started. You can walk in a straight line and arrive at the beginning. The basin is a closed surface, a loop, a space that refers only to itself. And something lives in it, or at the very least, something occupies it. Something that walks in metronomic footsteps and stops when you stop and never lets itself be seen. I sat by that spring for a long time. I don't know how long, because I no longer trusted either of my watches. The analog now read 12:03 p.m. The digital read 5:58 p.m. The discrepancy was growing. I thought about the hiker in 2004, found on the interstate 60 miles away. I thought about Marcus Devlin, found in Carverton 11 miles away. They hadn't walked out. They hadn't found the edge. They'd simply appeared somewhere else, after time had passed that they didn't experience. And I thought about Walter Pembroke, who went in and never appeared anywhere at all. What was the difference? What determined whether you eventually came out? I didn't know. I still don't know. But I decided that sitting still had worked before. It was my hypothesis for why those other men survived. And I was going to commit to it fully. I was going to stop trying to leave. I was going to sit by this spring and wait for whatever mechanism relocated people out of this basin to take effect. So I sat. I leaned against the foundation stones of the old homestead, and I looked up at the canopy, and I breathed, and I waited. The light began to change. Not like sunset, not a reddening or dimming in a particular direction, more like the overall brightness was slowly fading, uniformly, as if someone were turning down a dimmer switch on the entire sky. The forest grew darker by degrees. The canopy above me became less distinct. The shadows, which had been absent all day, began to appear, but they didn't point in any consistent direction. They just deepened, pools of darkness forming between the roots, filling the hollows in the old foundation. And the footsteps came back, from multiple directions this time, south, east, west. The same metronomic rhythm, but 3 or 4 sources now instead of 1. All at the same distance, all approaching at the same pace, all invisible. I didn't move. I sat against those stones, and I gripped my own knees, and I didn't move. The footsteps grew louder, closer, the sound of leaves being compressed under weight. Real, physical weight. Something was coming toward me from every direction, and I could not see it, and I did not move. And then, I need to be careful here, because what I'm about to tell you is the part I'm least certain about. The part where my memory becomes unreliable in a way I can feel but can't correct. I was sitting by the spring. The footsteps were very close. The light was almost gone. And then I was standing on the shoulder of Forest Road 227, not walking, not stumbling out of the woods, standing, upright, on the gravel shoulder of the road. My truck was visible about 200 yards ahead at the wide spot where I'd parked it. It was night, full dark, stars visible through gaps in the canopy overhead. I walked to my truck. I sat in the driver's seat. I turned on my phone. The date was correct. Still Wednesday, still October. But the time was 9:47 p.m. I'd entered the basin at approximately 8:05 a.m. 13 hours and 42 minutes had elapsed. My analog watch read 12:22 p.m. My digital watch read 9:51 p.m. The digital had roughly tracked real-world time after all. The analog had not. I drove home. I didn't call anyone. I didn't report anything. I walked into my apartment and I sat on my couch in the dark. And I stayed there until morning. I didn't go to work the next day. I called in sick, the first time in 3 years. I spent the day sitting on my couch, trying to decide what to do with what I knew. Here's what I knew. Packer Basin is a spatially anomalous area where the interior geometry does not correspond to the exterior boundaries. Time passes inconsistently within it, with mechanical timekeeping devices apparently more affected than electronic ones. It is devoid of observable biological life other than plant matter. It contains at least one entity or phenomenon that manifests as audible but invisible locomotion. People who enter it are sometimes relocated outside it after a period of elapsed time they do not experience, and are sometimes not relocated at all. And the United States Forest Service has known about this since at least 2004, and possibly since 1987 or earlier, and has chosen to manage it with a closure order and a falsified justification rather than investigate or disclose it. That was 11 months ago. I went back to work after my sick day. I cleaned fire rings and checked feed tubes and talked to visitors at trailhead kiosks. I drove forest roads and noted erosion. I did my job. Dale never asked me about my absence, and I never brought it up. But something between us had changed. A weight in his silences that hadn't been there before, as if he knew where I'd been without needing to be told. Maybe he did. Maybe there's a trail camera on FR 227 that I didn't notice. Maybe he just recognized the look. I don't know. I tried, in those first weeks after, to return to normalcy, to let Packer Basin be a closed door in my mind the way it was a closed area on my map. I told myself that I'd satisfied my curiosity, that I'd gone in and come out, and now I knew, and knowing was enough. But knowing wasn't enough, because the knowing didn't stay contained. It started with the overlook at Sawyer Knob, my usual lunch spot. 3 weeks after my trip into the basin, I was eating a sandwich and looking out at the landscape, and my eyes drifted, as they always did, to that cupped hand drainage to the northwest. And for the first time, I saw something moving in the canopy. Not a bird, not wind in the leaves, a ripple, like the surface of a pond when something passes beneath it. A displacement that moved from the southern end of the basin toward the northern outlet, slowly over the course of about 30 seconds. The canopy moving as if something very large were passing underneath it, brushing the crowns of trees that stand 80 feet tall. I lowered my sandwich. I watched. The ripple reached the northern edge of the basin and stopped. And then, I'm certain of this, it reversed direction, came back south, same speed, same displacement. As if something had walked to the edge of its enclosure, found the boundary, and turned around. I watched for another hour. I saw it twice more. The same path. North to the edge, pause, return south. Pacing. From the outside, Packer Basin has edges. From the inside, it doesn't. But whatever is in there, knows where the edges are from the inside, even if a person can't find them. It paces them, back and forth, like something that remembers what out means. I don't know why I could see it now, when I'd never seen it in 2 years of lunches at that overlook. Maybe it wasn't doing it before. Maybe I wasn't looking correctly. Or maybe going inside had changed my relationship to the place in some way I can't articulate. Like it knew I'd been there and was no longer hiding from me. That thought disturbed me more than what I'd experienced inside the basin. I went to see Harold again. A Saturday, off duty, in civilian clothes. He met me at the door, and before I said anything, he looked at my face and said, "You went in." I nodded. He didn't seem surprised. He didn't seem angry or worried. He just looked tired. He stepped back and let me in, and we sat at the same kitchen table, and he poured coffee into the same mugs. "How long?" he asked. 13 hours. I experienced maybe 5. I came out on FR 227. He nodded. "Closer than the others?" "They ended up miles away. You were right next to your vehicle." He considered this. Maybe it matters that you knew, that you'd heard the stories beforehand. The others didn't know what they were walking into. I told him about the spatial distortion, the inability to find the slopes, the climbing that led back to the spring. He nodded at all of it, like I was confirming things he already knew, or at least suspected. "My team experienced something similar," he said. "Not as extreme. We could still see the slopes. We could still orient. But the distances were wrong. Took us twice as long to cover ground as it should have. We wrote it off as difficult terrain, but there wasn't anything difficult about it. Flat ground, open understory. Should have been easy walking." He shook his head. "We were in there for 13 hours too. Same number as you. I don't think that's a coincidence." I asked him if he'd seen the canopy movement, the pacing. He set his coffee down. "No. What do you mean, pacing?" I described what I'd seen from Sawyer Knob, the ripple in the canopy, the north-south-north pattern. His face changed as I spoke, not dramatically, but a tightening around the mouth, a stillness in the eyes that hadn't been there before. "How tall would something have to be," he said slowly, "to displace canopy at that height?" I'd done that math already. 80-foot trees, give or take. Something brushing the crowns would need to be at least 60 feet tall moving through the understory beneath them, or it would need to be in the canopy itself, somehow displacing the crowns laterally as it passed. Neither explanation is acceptable. I know that. 60-foot organisms don't exist in Appalachian forests. Nothing exists that could move through a mature hardwood canopy and displace it in that pattern. But I saw what I saw, and I saw it 3 times in one afternoon. Harold was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "In 2004, after my team came out, after the regional people came and gave us the magnetic anomaly story, one of my volunteers called me at home. A man named Darren Sykes. Good woodsman. Hunted his whole life. He told me that during the search, while we were on the grid in the basin, he looked up at one point and saw the canopy moving. He said it looked like something was circling us, overhead, in the trees. He said it went around us 3 times and then stopped. He didn't tell anyone during the search because he thought he was losing his mind." "What happened to Darren?" I asked. "Moved to Florida about 2 years later. Never went in the woods again as far as I know." Harold stared into his coffee. I thought he was seeing things. Stress. The time discrepancy had us all rattled. But if you're seeing the same thing from outside... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. I left Harold's house and drove home, and that night I did something I'd been putting off. I dug through my grandfather's things. After he died in 2016, my mother had boxed up his personal effects and given them to me because I was the one who'd followed him into the Forest Service, even if it was decades later at a different agency. Most of it was ordinary: tools, clothing, a few old photographs. But there was a small leather journal that I'd glanced at once, years ago, and set aside because the handwriting was difficult and I hadn't had the patience. I sat at my kitchen table and read the entire thing. It took 4 hours. Most of it was daily notes from his work: tree counts, road conditions, weather observations. Mundane. The kind of record a conscientious forestry worker keeps. But in September of 1971, 2 months after Walter Pembroke went missing, there were 3 entries that stopped me. September 3rd, 1971. Hiked Packer B with Orville and Stan to check timber stand. Arrived 0700. Departed what I thought was 1400. Was 2030. None of us can account for the time. Orville will not go back. September 15th, 1971. RO sent 2 men to the district. They want the Pembroke file. They want all references to Packer B removed from the timber survey. I was told not to discuss with anyone, ever. September 22nd, 1971. I dreamed about the basin. I was standing by the spring and something very tall was walking between the trees. It stopped when it knew I was looking. I woke up and it was 3 a.m. and I could hear footsteps on my porch, but there was nothing there. That was it. 3 entries. He never mentioned Packer Basin again in the journal. Not once in the remaining 15 years of entries. As if the subject had been excised from his mind as thoroughly as it had been excised from the official records. But he'd told me, when I was 8 or 9, disguised as a joke. A tall tale about a place where the day was longer than it should be. He'd found a way to pass it on without passing on the weight. And somehow, through whatever chain of decisions leads a person from childhood to adulthood, it had brought me here. To this district, to this job, to this basin. I don't believe in fate. I don't believe in destiny. I believe in choices, in causes, in the ordinary mechanics of how lives unfold. But I cannot fully explain why I applied to this specific district for this specific position, when there were other openings elsewhere that would have served my career better. I told myself it was because of my grandfather. Because of family connection, because these were the mountains I'd heard about as a child. And maybe that's all it is. Or maybe Packer Basin has a gravity to it. Maybe it pulls people back. Maybe that's why Walter Pembroke never came out, because he'd been there before and the basin held on tighter this second time. I don't know. I don't know how to know. Here's where I am now. 11 months later, I still work in the district. I still eat lunch at Sawyer Knob. I still watch the basin. The pacing has not stopped. 2 or 3 times per week, I can see the canopy displacement. North to south to north. Back and forth. Whatever is in there is still in there, and it is still moving. The 5-year closure renewal was due in 2024. It was renewed. I saw the new order in the digital system. Same language. Threatened and endangered species. Same regional signature. Good through 2029. I have not been back inside. I want to be clear about that. I have not re-entered Packer Basin, and I do not intend to. 1 trip was enough. More than enough. But I need to be honest about something else. And this is the part that frightens me most. I want to go back. Not out of curiosity. I've satisfied my curiosity. I know what's in there. Or at least, I know enough to know that it can't be understood with the tools I have. What I feel is different from curiosity. It's more like recognition. Like the basin is a place I belong to in some way that predates my decision to work here. That my grandfather belonged to it. That it has been part of my family's relationship to this landscape for 50 years. And that relationship isn't finished. I know that's irrational. I know it might be exactly the kind of pull that drew Walter Pembroke back in and kept him there forever. I know that the distance between curiosity and compulsion can be measured in single footsteps. So I watch from Sawyer Knob. I eat my lunch and I watch the canopy, and I do not go closer. Every day that I maintain that distance is a day I've won. But I'm aware, honestly, fully aware, that the distance is shrinking, not physically. I don't mean I'm hiking closer. I mean that the resistance I feel to going back is slightly less than it was the month before. And the month before that. And the month before that. Like erosion. Like the way a creek slowly undercuts a bank that looks solid from above. Last month, I was driving FR 227 for a routine road inspection. Standard work. I drive that road 4 or 5 times a year. But this time, when I reached the wide spot where I'd parked in October, I pulled over. I turned off the engine. I sat there for 15 minutes looking at the tree line where the old CCC trail begins its descent into the basin. I didn't get out of the truck, but I wanted to. My hand was on the door handle for most of those 15 minutes. And when I finally started the engine and drove away, it felt like tearing something, like pulling a fishhook out of my own chest. I told my neighbor about Packer Basin last week, not the full story, not the spatial distortion, not the footsteps, not my grandfather's journal, just that there's a closed area in the forest that I'd gone into and that it had disturbed me, and that if I ever don't come home from work, she should tell the sheriff to look for my truck on FR 227. She asked me why I was telling her this. I said, because I'm not sure I won't go back. She looked at me like I was someone she didn't quite recognize. And I realized that was fair, because I'm not sure I recognize myself anymore either. Not fully. Something in me shifted when I was inside that basin. When the ground wouldn't rise and the footsteps came from every direction and the light faded without a sunset. Something in me stayed in there. Or something from in there came out with me. I don't know which, and I'm not sure it matters. I still drive past Packer Basin on my patrols. I still eat lunch at Sawyer Knob. I still watch the canopy pacing. And every time I'm on FR 227, the pull is slightly stronger than the last time. The closure order says 2029. 5 more years. Maybe by then it won't matter, because I'll have transferred out or I'll have found some other way to put distance between myself and that drainage. Or maybe by then the pull will have won, and I'll have walked down those CCC switchbacks one more time. And I'll be the next person who either appears on a road 60 miles away with no memory, or doesn't appear at all. Harold told me something the last time I saw him. He said, "The ones who come out are the ones who don't go looking for it. They stumble in. They don't know what they're entering. And the basin lets them go. But Pembroke had been in before. He knew what it was. He went back on purpose. I went in on purpose. The basin let me out anyway. Once. I'm not confident it would do so again. I still drive FR 227. I still slow down at the wide spot. I still feel the hook in my chest. Some days that's all this is. A man driving past a place he shouldn't have gone, feeling something he can't name pulling at him from below the tree line. A minor, manageable haunting, a thing I can live beside without being consumed by. And other days, I look at that tree line, and I think, my grandfather heard those footsteps on his porch in 1971, and he spent the next 45 years not going back. and it still found its way into the stories he told his grandchildren. 50 years of distance, and it still passed the knowledge on. Still put me here. Still drew me in. I don't think the closure order is meant to keep people out. I think it's meant to keep whatever is in there from having anyone to pull back in. And I think it's failing, slowly, one renewed order at a time, because the pull doesn't care about paperwork. It doesn't care about fences or signs or regional signatures. It cares about the people who have been inside it, and it does not let them go, not really, not completely. My grandfather never went back. He held out for 45 years. That's my benchmark. That's what I'm trying to match. 45 years of pulling over on the shoulder and not opening the door. I've done 11 months. I'll let you know how year 2 goes.